A scream tore through the winter night, muffled by marble walls swallowed by snow, and then silence. The servants froze mid-step, their gloved hands trembling over silver trays, as the echo of something broken rippled through the grand halls of Ashbourne Manor. Outside, the wind hurled itself against the windows, rattling the glass as if desperate to flee what it had heard within. It was the wedding night of Duke Sebastian Hawthorne, hero of Salamanca, heir to a fortune built on blood and lineage, and his new wife, Lady Evangeline Pembroke, a girl of soft manner and uncertain rank. England had toasted their union as a triumph of reconciliation between old power and fading grace. Yet upstairs, behind the locked doors of the bridal chamber, that union had already begun to splinter. Sebastian stood by the dying fire, his face carved in shadow. The pale gleam of his uniform buttons caught the light, relics of the war he had survived though not entirely escaped. His hands, once steady on the battlefield, now trembled with something colder than fear. "I told them I would not marry," he said, voice low and ragged, "and yet here I stand, trapped by duty, by deceit, by every false smile that calls itself honor." Evangeline flinched, though his anger was not aimed at her alone. The lace of her wedding gown whispered against the floor as she took a hesitant step forward. "I did not wish to trap you, my lord," she said softly. "I came to you as I was bid. I thought—" He cut her off. "You thought?" The words were a blade. "You thought a name could make you my equal? You thought pity could be mistaken for affection?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The flames behind him shuddered, throwing his silhouette tall and merciless across the room. She had seen him only twice before the ceremony, once at a garden fete where he had barely met her eye, and once in church, where he had looked as though prayer itself pained him. Yet when her father had fallen into debt, and the Pembroke estate teetered on ruin, the Hawthorne name had seemed like salvation. "I am not your enemy," she whispered, the words trembling like candlelight. "If there has been some misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" His laugh was sharp, joyless. "You stand there draped in silk as if innocence could disguise ambition." Her breath caught. "You think I married you for gain?" "I think," he said, stepping closer, "that you married a title, not a man. And I think I would sooner die a widower than live a fool." The blow landed soundlessly, not on her skin but on her soul. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken cruelty. She wanted to protest, to tell him she had dreamed of kindness, not crowns, that she had prayed for his safe return long before his name was bound to hers. But pride, that fragile armor of the wounded, held her tongue. He turned away, jaw set. "You will have every comfort, every courtesy," he said. "But my touch, my affection, those you shall not have. I swore to give my life to England, and it seems I must swear again, never to give my heart to you." The words fell like frost. Something inside her, that delicate hope born of girlhood and candlelit prayers, cracked quietly. She stood perfectly still, a statue of grace betrayed as he strode to the door. His hand paused on the handle, perhaps expecting her to weep, to plead, to soften his resolve. She did none of these. When she spoke, her voice was calm, even tender. "Then I shall hold you to your vow, your grace," she said. "But may God have mercy on a man who builds his own prison." For a moment, something flickered in his gaze, not guilt, not sorrow, but the ghost of both. Then he was gone, leaving only the echo of his boots on the marble floor and the faint scent of rain-damp wool. The hours crawled. Downstairs, the last of the wedding candles guttered out, and gossip began to bloom in the silence they left behind. The Duchess's maid whispered that his grace had retired to his study. A footman swore he saw her crying in the chapel. By morning, rumor had outrun reason. The Duke's rejection had become a scandal embroidered with cruelty, his wife's composure mistaken for pride. London's drawing rooms, ever hungry, would feast on the tale before the week was out. In the days that followed, Evangeline moved through the manor like a spirit in exile. She spoke little, smiled when required, and spent long hours in the library, the only room untouched by his presence. The snow outside thickened, and the great house, built for laughter and legacy, settled into a silence so profound it seemed to mourn with her. Sebastian, meanwhile, buried himself in work, estate accounts, military correspondence, anything that demanded precision instead of feeling. Yet every so often, he would pass a door left ajar and glimpse her at the pianoforte, head bowed, the melody slow and unguarded. The sound followed him through the corridors like a haunting he could neither confront nor escape. One evening he found a rose, small, half-wilted, left upon his desk. No note accompanied it. He stared at it for a long time, anger rising not from hatred but from the unbearable gentleness of the gesture. He crushed the stem in his fist, unaware that the thorn had drawn blood. That night, as he washed the wound, his reflection caught in the mirror, the same eyes that had faced battle now filled with something he could not name. He told himself it was resentment. It was safer that way. Evangeline never mentioned the rose. She did not ask why he avoided the chapel or why his voice grew harsher when the snow began to fall. She merely endured, as women of her rank were taught to do, gracefully, invisibly. Yet within her, a quiet defiance began to stir. She would not beg for warmth from a man frozen by pride. If she was to live unloved, she would at least live unbroken. By December's end, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The portraits stared from their gilded frames, the hearths burned low, and even the servants spoke in murmurs. The Duke dined alone, the Duchess prayed alone. Their marriage existed as a rumor even within its own walls. And yet, sometimes when the candles guttered and the wind howled through the eaves, she would think she heard footsteps pause outside her door. Just once, faintly, a shadow lingered there, his perhaps, before retreating down the corridor. On New Year's Eve, she stood before the window of her chamber, watching the snow swallow the last of the light. Somewhere in the house, a clock began to chime. She thought of vows, his cold and binding, hers silent and faithful, and wondered which would break first. Below, in his study, Sebastian sat motionless, the untouched rose pressed between the pages of a ledger. The snow outside pressed its white face against the glass as if demanding witness. He closed his eyes and for a fleeting instant, imagined her hand reaching for his in the dark. He opened them again and the room was empty. The wind rose, sharp as glass, rattling the door that divided their worlds. And in that fragile pause between one year and the next, something unspoken began to shift, like a promise trembling just before it breaks. The letter arrived on a morning heavy with fog, sealed in crimson wax, its edges damp from the mist, its contents sharper than any blade. By nightfall, every whispering mouth in London would know. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne lived as strangers beneath the same gilded roof. The news spread not as gossip, but as spectacle, the downfall of a union too cold to survive. In drawing rooms and tea parlors, ladies leaned closer to one another, lowering their voices only enough to make their words sound holy. He has not touched her once, they said, fanning themselves with moral outrage and secret delight. 2 years wed and still she has no heir. Some pitied her. More pitied him. At Ashbourne Manor, the fog lingered long after the letter's ink had dried. The Duke, ever punctual, stalked through his duties as though nothing had shifted. But the servants had learned to move quietly, sensing the tension in every ticking clock, every unopened door. Evangeline still kept her morning ritual, a walk through the East Garden where roses struggled against frost, though the flowers, like her hopes, had long since withered. She no longer dreamed of warmth. Instead, she gathered fragments of peace wherever she could find them. In the laughter of the children she tutored in the village, in the pages of psalms she read by candlelight, in the stillness of the house once the Duke's footsteps faded down the hall. Her beauty had not diminished. If anything, solitude had carved her into something rarer, more dignified. Yet that quiet grace only deepened the ache in those who observed her, like a painting too exquisite to touch. It was late December when London society descended upon the county for the Christmas festivities. Invitations had been issued weeks prior, the Duke's name gracing them with reluctant formality. For appearance's sake, he would host one evening of revelry before retreating into the safety of isolation once more. The Duchess, true to habit, prepared the house for guests with a precision that spoke not of joy but of duty. She inspected every wreath, every table setting, ensuring perfection because perfection was the only defense left to her. On the night of the ball, Ashbourne Manor bloomed with candlelight and deceit. The chandeliers blazed, laughter echoed through the corridors, the air shimmered with perfume and pretense. The Duke entered fashionably late, dressed in black velvet, his medals glinting faintly beneath the glow. Applause rippled through the hall, polite, admiring, hollow. He greeted his guests with courtesy carved from habit, his composure unmarred even when a certain Countess Lydia Vale swept into his orbit, a widow renowned for her wit, and for the scandal that followed her like perfume. Her smile lingered too long, her words brushed too close. And when she laughed, heads turned. Evangeline, watching from across the ballroom, did not move. Her face remained serene, her hands folded lightly at her waist. Yet every syllable of that woman's laughter seemed to strike against her heart like glass against stone. Still she did not falter. When the musicians struck the first waltz, she moved to the pianoforte, her fingers gliding over the keys with quiet command. The melody that followed silenced the crowd, a song both mournful and regal, echoing through the high ceilings like the ghost of something sacred. Sebastian's head turned. For the first time that evening his gaze found her, truly found her. Her eyes did not meet his, but the music did, piercing the armor he had so carefully forged. It was a sound he remembered from a winter long past, the same melody his mother once played to calm him after battle. A lifetime seemed to collapse between the notes. When the song ended, applause filled the room, yet neither of them moved. He turned away first, muttering a stiff compliment to the Countess, but his hand trembled faintly around his glass. Evangeline, lips pressed tight, stood and slipped from the room, leaving only silence in her wake. Later that night, as the last carriage wheels vanished into fog, the Duke found himself in his study, the taste of guilt bitter on his tongue. He poured brandy he did not want, reading letters he did not comprehend. Then, among the papers he found it, a small object wrapped in linen. When he unfolded it, a rose petal fell out, dry and fragile as breath. Beneath it lay a short note, written in the elegant hand he knew too well. For the years that silence has taken, may it not take everything. He stared at the words until they blurred. He could not recall when she had left it, perhaps that morning, perhaps a week ago. He wanted to burn it, to rid himself of the ache it stirred. But instead he placed it carefully inside the drawer where he kept his war medals, an act both shameful and holy. Days passed. The scandal rippled outward, reaching Parliament, then the Queen's ear. The whispers took on sharper edges. The Duke will annul it soon. The Duchess has fallen ill. The Countess has been seen at Ashbourne twice this week. None of it entirely true, but truth mattered little in a world that preferred tragedy well-dressed. Evangeline endured each rumor as she endured everything, silently, gracefully, with eyes that had forgotten how to plead. She began writing letters she never sent, to her father, to God, to the man she had married. Words became her refuge, though she tore most of them up before the ink had dried. Then one evening her maid, a quiet girl named Clara, brought her an envelope left anonymously in the corridor. Inside was a single sheet bearing 6 words. He will seek you before dawn. Her heart jolted, not with hope but with dread. She did not sleep that night, sitting instead by the fire until the embers dimmed. When dawn finally broke, pale and merciless, no one came. The message, it seemed, had been a cruel trick, or perhaps a servant's foolish attempt at comfort. Yet the damage had been done. Expectation was a dangerous thing to awaken. Downstairs, Sebastian received his own letter, this one unsigned, its ink slightly smudged. It accused the Duchess of corresponding with a former suitor, of plotting her escape to London under the guise of visiting her ailing aunt. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and false. He read it twice, the old fury igniting like flint. Without pause, he crumpled the paper into the fire, watching it curl and blacken. But long after the flames died, the doubt remained. That evening, Evangeline caught sight of him in the corridor. For the briefest instant, their gazes met, 2 lonely souls bound by pride and rumor. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Then he turned sharply away, leaving her with the hollow rhythm of his footsteps echoing through the marble hall. Later, in her chamber, she sat before the mirror, the faint reflection of herself fading in candlelight. She reached for her quill, intending to write once more, not to him this time but to her own heart. Yet when she touched the ink, the words refused to form. Somewhere below, a door slammed. A storm was rising again. And as thunder rolled across the distant moors, the Duchess whispered into the silence, half prayer, half prophecy, "If love is to ruin me, let it at least have the courage to arrive." The storm began before sunset, a violence of wind and snow that devoured the countryside, cutting off every road leading to Ashbourne Manor. Servants bolted shutters and stoked fires, their faces drawn and anxious, while thunder rolled over the hills like the growl of some ancient beast. By nightfall, the grand house stood alone against the tempest, an island of flickering light in a sea of white. Evangeline sat in the library, her needlework untouched, listening to the wind tear at the chimneys. The guests expected for Christmas Eve had sent word of their delay, and the household had grown strangely still. Somewhere in that silence she could sense him, Sebastian, pacing his study, restless, haunted. For 2 years they had lived in separate wings, their words few and measured, their glances rarer still. Yet tonight the storm's fury felt like an echo of everything they had refused to speak. A crash sounded from the courtyard, a carriage, its wheels splintered, horses screaming. Without hesitation, Evangeline rose and hurried toward the commotion. The servants were already at the door, lanterns swaying wildly as they struggled against the wind. Through the flurries a small figure appeared, a woman clutching a child, her face blue with cold. "Please," the woman gasped, "we were bound for the village." The storm. "Bring them in," Evangeline ordered, her calm steadying the panic. She guided the strangers to the hearth, her voice soft as she called for blankets, broth, brandy. The child, no more than 6, shivered violently, coughing into her sleeve. Evangeline knelt beside him, rubbing his hands, murmuring words she herself needed to hear. "You're safe now. You'll be warm soon." When Sebastian entered, the sight stopped him cold. His wife, the woman he had so carefully walled himself against, knelt before the fire, her gown damp, her face illuminated by the flames. There was nothing regal in her then, nothing of the Duchess. Only gentleness. Humanity. He stood in the doorway a moment too long, the memory of battlefields stirring behind his eyes, the dying men he could not save, the same helplessness now twisting his chest. Finally he spoke. "They should be taken to the guest quarters," he said, his tone rougher than intended. Evangeline looked up, startled. "The east wing is too cold," she replied evenly. "They'll stay here by the fire until the storm eases." For the first time in months their eyes locked. The air between them was neither cold nor warm, only charged with something fragile, dangerous. Then the child stirred, breaking the spell. Sebastian turned to leave, but the woman's trembling voice stopped him. "Your Grace," she said, "you've saved our lives. God bless you both." He hesitated. He had done nothing. The words should have fallen to Evangeline. Yet hearing them directed at him, he felt a strange ache, an awareness of all the things he might have been, had he not hardened himself against kindness. Hours passed. The storm refused to relent. Evangeline tended the strangers as though they were kin, her hands steady, her voice soothing. Sebastian watched from the shadows, caught between admiration and remorse. When the child finally fell asleep, she covered him with her shawl and sank into a chair, exhaustion softening the lines of her face. "You need rest," he said quietly from across the room. She startled slightly. "So do you. I'm used to sleepless nights." "As am I." The words hung in the air, sharper than any argument. He moved closer, as if drawn by something beyond will. "You shouldn't expose yourself to the cold," he murmured. "It's not your duty to tend every soul that knocks upon our door." Her eyes met his, calm and unflinching. "If I waited for duty to make me kind," she said, "there would be no kindness left in this house." He flinched, not from the truth but from how gently she spoke it. The storm howled through the chimneys, the fire hissed and spat. In its glow, she looked almost otherworldly, the fragile strength of her spirit illuminated against his guilt. "I never wished to be cruel," he said at last, his voice breaking like ice underfoot. She looked down at the sleeping child. "Cruelty rarely begins as a wish." Something inside him faltered. He crossed the room slowly, unsure whether he moved from apology or instinct. When he reached her, he paused, afraid the mere act of standing so close might shatter what little peace remained between them. "Evangeline," he said, her name almost foreign on his tongue. "I thought distance would protect us both. I see now it only turned us to ghosts." She did not turn toward him, but her voice trembled when she spoke. "You swore never to touch me, Sebastian. And yet every silence has wounded me more deeply than any touch could." The confession hung between them, soft as snow, devastating as truth. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, the vow he had made years ago pressing against the need to undo it. At last, his fingers brushed the fabric of her sleeve. Just a touch, tentative, reverent. She froze. Then, slowly she turned to face him. His expression was unguarded for once, stripped of pride, of the armor he had worn even in sleep. "I am sorry," he whispered. "For the years I let pride speak in my place." Her eyes shimmered, not with forgiveness yet, but with the painful recognition of sincerity. "If you are seeking absolution, I cannot grant it," she said softly. "But if you are seeking peace, perhaps we might find it together." Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the fragile reconciliation blooming within its walls. He wanted to speak again, to tell her how the war had broken him, how every scream on the battlefield had followed him home. But the words tangled in his throat, unfit for the gentleness of her presence. Instead, he simply stood there, and for the first time did not look away. A log in the fire cracked, scattering sparks between them. Evangeline rose, her movements slow, deliberate. "You should see that the stables are secured," she said, her tone half command, half plea, not for distance but for composure. He nodded, though he lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. "When I return," he murmured, "I would speak with you." Properly. She inclined her head, wary but not cold. Then return safely, your grace. He left, the door closing softly behind him. Alone, she knelt once more beside the sleeping child, her hands trembling now that no one could see. The storm's roar deepened, pressing against the windows like an accusation. For the first time since her wedding night, she allowed herself to hope, and that frightened her more than his anger ever had. Upstairs, Sebastian paused in the corridor, his hand resting on the banister. The sound of her voice still lingered in his mind, the warmth of it, the ache. Somewhere beneath his ribs, something long dormant stirred awake. A servant appeared breathless at the end of the hall. "Your Grace," he cried, "the north stable roof, it's given way." Sebastian's heart lurched. Without hesitation he turned and ran into the storm. Behind him, in the silent warmth of the library, the fire flickered once, and went out. The church bells rang through the snow-draped village, sharp and insistent, announcing the approach of midnight. Every echo rolled across Ashbourne Manor, rattling windows and stirring the hearth fires, as though the entire house held its breath for what was to come. Inside, the ballroom glimmered with candlelight, polished floors reflecting the golden blaze, and yet the grandeur felt hollow, a stage set for appearances rather than warmth. Evangeline stood near the French doors, the ivory silk of her gown brushing the polished floor, her fingers intertwined at her waist. She had spent hours preparing herself not for guests, for there were none, but for the confrontation she had longed to avoid. The storm had finally passed, leaving snow glittering like scattered diamonds across the grounds. Moonlight streamed through the panes, illuminating the frost and glinting on the chandeliers above. She breathed deeply, steadying the flutter of her heart. The doors opened and he entered. Sebastian moved with a purposeful calm, his boots soft against the oak floor, his black velvet coat tailored to perfection, his metals glinting faintly beneath the light. He carried an object wrapped in velvet, something precious, heavy with meaning. The room seemed to contract as he approached, every heartbeat measured against the silence that stretched between them. She did not speak. She did not move. And yet, in the quiet, the air between them seemed charged, a taut line of tension that had taken years to form. He paused a mere foot away, placing the wrapped item carefully on a low table, his fingers brushing the velvet with reverence. "I owe you this," he said at last, voice low and thick with emotion. "Not as a husband, perhaps, but as a man who has wronged you." Evangeline's breath caught. "A gift?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "More than a gift," he murmured. "A symbol. Of what should have been, and what might still be." Her gaze fell on the object, a small gilded box. She lifted the lid carefully, revealing a delicate heirloom, a ring once belonging to his mother, set with a single flawless ruby. The stone seemed to pulse in the candlelight, deep red as her own blood, as though it carried the weight of the years she had endured. "I cannot accept this," she said, though her voice betrayed her longing. "It is too much, too sudden and too final." He shook his head. "Nothing is final. Not yet." He stepped closer, the heat of his presence brushing against her, filling the room with a tension she could no longer deny. "I have spent years defending my pride, my honor, my duty. But none of it mattered, Evangeline, not a single day. Not a single hour. Until I saw you tonight and realized that everything I swore, every vow to remain distant, was a lie. My heart has spoken while my lips remain silent. I cannot survive another winter without this, without you." Her hands trembled as she reached for the ring. His eyes, dark and unyielding, searched hers, and in that gaze she saw not arrogance, nor war, nor cold calculation, but a man undone by desire, fear, and devotion. "I have waited," she said quietly, "for 2 years. 2 years in silence, enduring whispers and judgment. And now you stand before me, offering both contrition and longing. How can I know this is not another test?" He took her hand, gentle but insistent, guiding it to the ruby. "Because this time there is no pretense. I cannot pretend, Evangeline. I cannot hide. I cannot wait any longer. I swore never to touch you, never to claim what should have been freely given, but tonight I beg you to allow it. Not as a gift but as a truth." The candlelight flickered across her face, illuminating tears she had refused to shed in public, tears he had never seen. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of emotion, the pulse of hope and fear battling within her. And then, slowly, she nodded as if granting permission not merely to touch, but to bridge the gulf of years and sorrow between them. He reached for her, his hand brushing the delicate silk at her shoulder, lingering as if memorizing the warmth of her presence. She did not recoil. She did not step back. Instead, she allowed the contact, her own hand trembling as it found his. The moment was fragile, electric, and infinitesimal in its perfection. He lowered his gaze to hers, voice trembling. "I swore I would not touch you, Evangeline. And yet, I cannot live without your touch." Her lips parted slightly, a soft intake of breath that seemed to echo through the empty ballroom. He lifted his hand, cupping her cheek with reverence, careful not to overstep the fragile boundary of consent and trust. The warmth of his palm was startling after years of absence, and her heart raced in response. "Do you understand," he whispered, "that for years every moment I have been without this, without you, has been a torment I cannot name?" "Yes," she replied, her voice quivering. "I understand." Their eyes met, and for the first time in seasons of estrangement, Sebastian allowed himself to see her fully, not as a title, not as a duty, not as a symbol of social expectation, but as the woman who had endured so much, whose dignity had remained unbroken despite the world's cruelty. And in that recognition, something fragile, something long denied, began to bloom between them. He bent slightly, reverently, and pressed a single trembling kiss to the back of her hand, not the quick courtesy of a gentleman but a promise, a surrender, an acknowledgement of every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every ache of longing. Her chest tightened. A shiver ran through her. And yet, instead of fear, she felt a strange exhilaration, the knowledge that years of restraint were finally giving way to something undeniable and true. "I have loved you silently," he confessed, voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "And I have waited, foolishly, cruelly, until I could endure it no longer. You are mine, Evangeline, not by law, nor by duty, but by the very heart I never thought would beat again." She swallowed hard, her own tears spilling freely now. "And I have waited," she said. "I have endured the cold, the whispers, the distance, and I have loved you in silence as well. Perhaps now we may begin." The clock struck midnight, echoing through the marble corridors and high-ceilinged halls. The sound carried with it the promise of change, the end of an era of silence and the fragile beginning of intimacy. Snow drifted outside, sparkling like diamonds beneath the moonlight, as if the world itself bore witness to the thawing of hearts. Sebastian's hand lingered, brushing against hers once more, and she allowed herself to lean slightly into the warmth of his presence. The fire sputtered and glowed, casting shadows that danced around them, shadows that whispered of restraint overcome and of love at last allowed to breathe. "I will not fail you again," he murmured. "This is not merely a Christmas gift. This is my vow, my redemption, my confession." And in that single suspended heartbeat, the walls of Ashbourne Manor seemed to exhale, centuries of pride and sorrow yielding to the fragile, undeniable spark between them. Yet as they stood there, entwined in a quiet embrace, a faint sound echoed from the corridor outside, a footstep, deliberate and unfamiliar. Both turned, startled, hearts still racing as the house seemed to hold its breath once more. And in that moment, the future remained uncertain, the past unresolved, but the present, fragile, trembling, irrevocably alive, shone like the first light of dawn over the frost-kissed estate. The dawn broke over Ashbourne Manor like a confession, spilling pale gold across snow-draped gardens and frozen fountains. The world outside glittered with frost, each branch and blade of grass etched in crystal, and yet the warmth inside the house seemed even more miraculous, as though the fire that had been withheld for years had finally been lit. Evangeline rose early, her gown flowing like liquid silk as she moved through the corridors, each step measured and deliberate. She paused at the grand staircase, listening to the distant echo of footsteps that were no longer hesitant, no longer burdened by restraint. Sebastian descended with a quiet determination, his coat brushed and his eyes alight with attention that had nothing to do with propriety. In his hand, he carried the key to the greenhouse, a gesture so small, so intimate, that it might have been overlooked by any other observer. "Good morning," he said, voice low, yet carrying a warmth that startled her. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice steady despite the flutter of anticipation in her chest. The household was slowly awakening. Servants moved about with hushed awe, sensing the shift in the manor as though the very walls had absorbed the years of silence and were finally releasing their burden. No one spoke of the previous night, no one dared. It was as if even the smallest acknowledgement would shatter the fragile miracle that had begun to bloom between their masters. Sebastian approached her fully now, offering the key. "This is yours," he said. "Not as a husband to a wife, not as a lord to his lady, but as a man to the one woman who has endured everything and yet remained unbroken." Evangeline accepted it with trembling hands. The key was cold at first, but warmth seemed to travel through her fingers, as if the metal itself carried the promise of renewal. "You trust me?" she asked softly, more to herself than to him. "I trust you with my heart," he replied. "And that is more than I have ever entrusted to anyone." Outside, a soft wind stirred the snow, scattering it like powdered diamonds across the lawns. The manor's long shadows stretched and shrank as the sun climbed, each moment marking a world newly alive. Evangeline opened the door to the greenhouse. Inside, the air was sweet with the scent of roses forced into bloom by careful hands, their petals kissed by frost and light alike. Here, in this sanctuary of delicate growth, they were no longer Duke and Duchess bound by duty, nor the symbols of society's judgment. Here they were two souls, raw and unguarded, learning the contours of each other for the first time in years. He followed her inside, careful not to crowd, careful to respect the fragile trust they had begun to rebuild. His gaze lingered on her, memorizing the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair caught the morning light, the rise and fall of her chest as she inhaled the scent of the roses. She felt the weight of his eyes not as scrutiny, but as devotion, and it unspooled something within her that had been taught with restraint for too long. "You've transformed this place," he said, voice reverent, almost afraid to disturb the stillness. "I did it for you," she replied simply, "because I hoped, someday, we might be free enough to walk here together." He reached for her hand again, this time not a tentative brush but a deliberate, claiming touch. She did not flinch. She let her fingers entwine with his, marveling at the warmth and strength that had once been absent from her life. "I have wasted years," he murmured. "Wasted them in pride, in fear, in silence. And yet here we are, standing at the edge of something I dared not hope for." Her lips curved in the faintest smile, the kind that held both relief and lingering pain. "We have both endured," she said. "Perhaps it is time to endure together, not apart." The greenhouse seemed to exhale with them, the scent of roses mingling with the faint warmth of their closeness. Sebastian lowered his head slightly, pressing a kiss to the back of her hand, not a fleeting courtesy, but a gesture weighted with reverence, apology, and desire. The contact sent a shiver through her, one that was neither fear nor shame, but a recognition of what had been denied for too long. "I have loved you quietly, painfully for all these years," he confessed. "And I will love you loudly if you will allow me. I will spend my life making up for every moment I was absent in heart and spirit." Her eyes glistened. "And I will meet you there," she whispered. "I will meet you in that life. If only to prove that even silence can lead to truth." The sun rose higher, scattering light through the frosted panes. For a moment, the world beyond the glass seemed to fade, the years of gossip, of unfulfilled expectation, of rigid formality. All that remained was this fragile, luminous reality, two hearts reclaiming what had been stolen by pride and circumstance. Sebastian tilted his head, studying her with a tenderness that had once been foreign to him. "We are bound now," he said softly, "not by duty but by understanding. Not by law but by choice. And I choose you, Evangeline. I choose you wholly." She drew in a breath, steadying herself, the weight of the past years pressing against her chest and then lifting. "And I choose you," she said. "All of you, the man you are now and the man you have been too afraid to be." He leaned closer, hesitating at the very edge of propriety, of caution, of all the lessons he had clung to for so long. Then, with the smallest of movements, he closed the distance, pressing a reverent kiss to her cheek, lingering at the hollow beneath her ear. She felt the warmth of him seep into her bones, a heat she had been denied for far too long. A soft laugh escaped her, a sound she had not realized she possessed, and he smiled, a slow, cautious smile that mirrored the relief flooding through him. They moved together in silent accord, walking among the roses, hands intertwined, allowing themselves the simple, sacred intimacy of presence. And yet, even in this perfect moment, the world beyond the greenhouse pressed against them. The manor's corridors held whispers of servants stirring, of letters to be sent, of obligations that could not be entirely ignored. The past 2 years of pride, fear, and rumor could not vanish entirely with the dawn. Sebastian stopped, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face and said, "We are not free of it, Evangeline. Society will still speak. The world will still judge. But here, in this place, in this moment, we are unbound. And that must suffice for now." She nodded, leaning into his shoulder, feeling the solidity of him beneath the layers of tension and expectation. "For now," she whispered. The light shifted, falling across the ruby of the ring he had given her, across the frost-kissed petals of the roses, across the intertwined fingers that finally spoke what words had failed to convey for years. The house exhaled with them, the long winter yielding to something fragile and luminous. A beginning, however tenuous, that promised warmth where there had been frost. Outside, a faint wind rustled the branches of the oaks and maples, scattering snow across the frozen lawns. Somewhere, a distant carriage wheel clicked over ice. The manor seemed to pulse with possibility, the echoes of the past softening under the weight of something new.